Okay, welcome to debate night, everyone. We are live streaming this evening from both the Reality Teen page and the Talk on Main Street page, and I want to thank everyone who is able to join us tonight. We have kind of a special event planned today in preparation for the debate. We have Mike Gordon here from from PropWatch. Mike is a professor of computer and information technology at St. Petersburg College, and he founded PropWatch. And when I first heard him speak and first explored his site last week, I found it a really interesting insight into the ways propaganda tricks us, as well as some of these debate techniques that politicians use to answer difficult questions. So thanks for being here tonight, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm hoping that you can help us understand some of these tips and techniques that politicians use in these debates a little bit better so that we can have a sharper eye to understand what we're looking at as this debate unfolds tonight. So tell us a little bit about yourself, about PropWatch, and how this came together for you.
So PropWatch, the PropWatch project is a project that started in February 2016. That's when I started software development on the platform. The platform's been public since about mid-2018. And all we do on propwatch.org is we simply analyze content for the presence of propaganda techniques and for disinformation. So those two different pieces of data. Although we're also just in the last 6 months or so starting to look at conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking, because that's becoming more prominent as well. So that's Absolutely. Our main area of focus. And one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is the different techniques that politicians use, specifically Joe Biden and President Donald Trump. So we're going to talk about those different techniques and what you can expect to see tonight when you watch the debate.
Great. So as we kind of come into that, can you tell us a little bit, I mean, this may seem like a pretty basic question, but why do politicians need tips and tricks and techniques in debates?
Typically, politicians will use techniques when they're asked questions that are hard to answer. So in other words, if they're taking a very unpopular position on something and they're asked a hard question about it, the best way to respond to that question is by using a technique. And by using a technique, not only can you get out of having to take any cost for that question, you can also turn that around and turn it to your advantage. I'll give you a couple of different examples of that when we go over some of the techniques tonight, because some of the examples are just that. What I just mentioned is where you get a very hard question and you can actually not only not answer the question, but turn it around and use it to your advantage.
Excellent. All right. So one of the things that's very interesting about your site is that not only do you describe these techniques, you have really specific examples and often video of how these are used. So maybe you can talk to us about some of the most common techniques and just start to unpack that a little bit so that we understand what makes one different from another.
The most common techniques used, and a lot of us are very familiar with them, are usually deal with truth in some aspect. So typically, I believe the most common technique, propaganda technique used, is the false claim, misleading claim, half-truth, cherry picking. So all of those kind of truth-based claims are the most common ones. But and those, you can typically see those on any fact-checking website when a politician makes a false claim or a half-truth or something like that. But the other techniques, we go well beyond just the kind of fact-checking aspect of it, such as a straw man. That's a very effective technique. Mike Pence used it very effectively in the Harris-Pence debate. And a lot of politicians, use, for example, false equivalency. One technique which is used incredibly frequently in the last couple of years is whataboutism. You probably have actually heard of that technique now because it's actually mentioned quite a bit. but that's another one that's not, it's not, whataboutism is not a truth-based type of technique. It's another type that we'll get into. So we cover about on the website itself about 54 different techniques. And those are just
Do you want to show us that list on your page?
Yeah, sure. Let me just go over here. So we're sharing screen. Okay. Okay, so this is the website here. And if you just click on propaganda techniques, you can see this is the list of all the techniques that we list. And then for any single technique, if you just click on that, you can see textbook examples of that technique being used.
It's pretty cool. So you mentioned cherry picking as you were describing this overall. Take us through the definitions of some of these things. So personally, I think it's once you can name something, I think it really helps recognize it and think about it and give you some sort of power over it. In other words, you're less likely to be fooled by a trick if you can put a name on it and recognize that pattern. So help me understand some of the names that you've put to some of these techniques and how they work. What are some of the most important ones people should be able to recognize?
Well, everything on the list that we have is typically you'll find on, if you just type, if you just Googled propaganda techniques, you probably pull up Wikipedia's page, which has a lot of the same techniques. Oftentimes these techniques go by different names. So there might be 3 different names for the same technique, but it's, when you actually drill down on these, you'll notice there's actually not that many. Did my screen just get way bigger? Or is it just bigger on my end?
I think it's just you. I think we're good.
Okay, good. Because I'm super zoomed in here. I'm not sure what happened, but anyway. So when we go over the techniques for the 2 politicians we're talking about tonight, I'm going to actually talk about some of those definitions as I go through them. So we'll get an opportunity to do that. Okay.
So you'll give us an overview of some of these techniques, and then these 2 politicians are not exactly new to the scene. They each have sort of a set of go-to techniques that kind of work for them. So you'll help us
absolutely, yeah,
understand those. So why don't you start and go through some of these things, and then we'll talk about how that flows right into the what we should be expecting from these 2 politicians in particular.
Okay, so we'll start out with President Donald Trump, and some of these techniques we did 2 things. We looked at the last debate he had with Vice President Biden, and we also looked at prior debates that he had with Hillary Clinton. So you see a lot of the same techniques. He's very good at some of these. The one I'm going to mention first is fault is virtue. And that's a technique where you present a weakness as a strength by focusing on any positive aspect to it. So anytime Donald Trump is questioned about how little he paid in taxes, you will see him respond with a fault is virtue. And it's to say that he paid so little, it's actually shows how good he is at finding loopholes in the tax system. So that's presented as a strength, not a weakness. And you'll notice that when he's asked those questions. Another one which he uses fault as virtue for is when it's brought up his lack of political experience, that he always presents that as a virtue again, that he has no political experience. He's a businessman, and that's actually a positive. Joe Biden is 47 years life in public service. That's presented as actually as a fault, where normally that would be a virtue. It's presented as a fault. Probably one of the most interesting ones that Donald Trump used back in 2016 when presented with the fact that Barack Obama, he was making that, very well-known claim that Barack Obama wasn't actually a U.S. citizen. He actually used the fault as virtue to say, well, the fact that he pushed Barack Obama to release his show his birth certificate, he did a favor for the whole country. So even though, of course, that was completely false, the fact that he pushed Obama to do that was actually, he did a service to the country. And he even said he did a service to Barack Obama himself for doing that. So again, that's classic fault is virtue.
Cool.
Now, what we found is that's one of the most common ones that Donald Trump uses is fault is virtue.
Okay. What about, maybe we can go back and forth a little bit. What about Joe Biden? What's his comfort zone?
Joe Biden's most common technique, and something Joe Biden's very effective with, is common folk. So Joe Biden will talk about his days in Scranton. He'll talk about his father's, coming home from work. He'll talk about his middle class roots, and he's very skilled in at doing that. So you'll typically, in every Joe Biden debate, he will do some common folk. He also, in the last debate with Donald Trump, there were a lot of mentions of Trump golfing a lot, or different references to Trump being on the golf course. In one statement, he said, "Get out of your sand trap." So again, he's using common folk. He's trying to, separate himself from Donald Trump as far as he's one of the common folk. Donald Trump isn't.
Got it.
So that is the most common technique, and one of the most effective ones that Joe Biden uses consistently, even back to, debates that were 10 years ago.
And so those are two. So on the side of Donald Trump, what did you call it again? Something is virtue? Fault is virtue?
Fault is virtue.
Okay.
And I have a longer list here. That was just the first one.
Yeah. So let's hear about some of the other ones as well.
One of them you'll probably all know by now, because he uses it so often, is appeal to pity. So that's portraying yourself as a victim. But there's two sides to that. Not only does he portray himself as a victim, but by doing so, it gives him the justification to attack his opponents. So there's two advantages to that. So he can portray himself as the people's champion that's constantly under siege, as the victim, and he also uses that a lot to demonize the press. So there's a lot of connections there. So he can attack the press because he's the victim. So he can attack the press in a way no other politician has ever done before, and he can make it seem justified because he's the victim. So again, it's a very effective use of that technique. And Donald Trump probably does that more than, most politicians do, as we probably know that by now.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that a very common technique amongst politicians?
It's really not. I mean, I think if we did a search on PropWatch for appeal for pity, and I'm not sure because I'd have to do it right now, but you may only see clips of Donald Trump using that.
But the folksiness, that's actually, we've seen that trope, if you will, more than one time.
Well, the fault is virtue, you mean?
Yeah,
the common folk.
The common folk, yes.
Yeah, common folk. Some politicians are very good at common folk, and this may ring a few bells. Sarah Palin, very skilled with common folk, probably better than any other politician at using that. Mike Pence, very skilled at common folk again. Joe Biden, very skilled at common folk. So certain politicians are very skilled with that. They use it effectively. Donald Trump, in certain senses, very skilled at common folk, which is kind of interesting because, his background is not that of common folk, but he's very good at using that technique as well. I wouldn't say he's one of the top, 3, but he definitely uses it.
And so the benefit of that technique is to say, look, you and I, we're the same. We can relate to one another, so you can understand my story.
Establish a connection with that audience. I'm like one of you. I have the same challenges you have. I can relate to them.
Yep, I gotcha. All right, so fault is virtue.
Yeah, fault is virtue. Appeal to pity.
Appeal to pity.
One, yes. So you'll probably see those again when he's asked certain types of questions. Dog whistle. That's pretty obvious to a lot of folks now, that his law and order dog whistle, that, that's right out of the Nixon campaign. That was the same exact dog whistle back then. He's using it in a very similar fashion. He'll often say, and he said this, if you look back into debates of 2016 with Hillary Clinton, it was literally the exact same statements where he literally said to Hillary Clinton, you can't say law and order. So if you go and look at his last debate with Joe Biden, he said literally exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I kind of remember that moment.
Yeah.
So why does he do that?
It's just a dog
What's he
whistle.
trying to?
Yeah, it's a dog whistle. And most dog whistles have a racial, undertone to it. So that is, the thought of inner city being out of control, and people, should be worried about the suburbs and so on and so forth. Donald Trump will use the word suburbs, which could be a dog whistle for white communities, and he'll use
Right.
low-income housing. He doesn't, of course, say anything racial. Low-income housing could be a dog whistle for non-white communities. So he'll say statements like, if he ran our country, meaning Joe Biden, our suburbs will be gone.
Right. So he's trying to, he's using a dog whistle is basically a series of polite words that signal somewhat impolite or socially unacceptable.
Right. So you want to use kind of statements that have a racial undertone without ever having to, there's always a plausible deniability built into a dog whistle. So you can't be, it can't be proven that your dog, that you have a racial intent, because that plausible deniability is built into that. A real clear example of that is "Make America Great Again." What does that mean? It's a perfect dog whistle because it has a different meaning to everybody that, hears that slogan. It might mean one thing to one person, but it might have a racial meaning to another person. And of course, you can't say that you can't definitively say that has a racial undertone, because, I didn't mean anything racial by that.
Got it. So it's sneaky-ish.
Yeah, so that's one thing that's common with very good dog whistles is there's that plausible deniability built into it. So you can always say that no, didn't mean anything racial by that.
Right.
And there's no way to prove that there was any racial. You can't prove it, but that's why it's a dog whistle.
Got it. All right. What's next?
Scapegoating, specifically related to COVID. President Trump has called it the China virus, the China plague. Okay, I mean, those are clearly it's scapegoating China, and that's a very effective technique because beyond just directing the responsibility for the virus at China, it creates a bonding within that community. So whenever you scapegoat any victim, you create a stronger bond between those that are in your camp. So when you create a scapegoat, you're actually solidifying your support by doing so. So it's a very effective technique. And in this case, in the last debate, he did it with the COVID-19, constantly calling it the China virus, the China plague, and so on.
Right. So this is a way to sort of create an us versus them kind of feeling.
Yeah, and it also gives an avenue for a group to channel grievance, which makes people feel
and take
good
it off you.
Yes,
right.
If you have an avenue for grievance, so he provides that avenue.
Gotcha. Let's see what else. Biden has also done some clever things in terms of reframing questions, sometimes in a really fascinating way. For example, I believe in the last debate, the issue of drugs came up and something about his son and drug addiction. And he managed to turn that into what a lot of people said was his highlight of the debate. So how would you sort of describe what kind
Well, yeah,
taking an
I
issue
saw
and
that. I'm not sure that would be considered fault as virtue because it's not really fault of Joe Biden's. He may have been just defending his son in that case. And I do remember the point in the debate, and it probably was his strongest period in the whole debate. But that may have just been a genuine defense of his son in that case. But what that brings actually to the next technique, which is anything related to Hunter Biden is classic guilt by association. So none of these misdeeds, at least maybe they'll be implying some of them are directly related to Joe Biden, but at least in the last debate, all the attacks on Hunter Biden were classic guilt by association. So assigning the misdeeds of somebody that's connected to you because you're a connection with them. So
Right.
anytime Hunter Biden is attacked, that's simply guilt by association.
Right. Now, something that just sort of came to me as you were going through that. So these are essentially tricks that politicians use to take the sting out of a question and to deflect accusations and other sorts of negative things that could occur. But they probably also sometimes use some of these techniques as a way to get their point across as well. So
Yeah, they can either be used as a defense or an attack. Either way. So guilt by association is obviously an attack on Biden, even though he didn't do certain things. His close relation to his son, we can just talk about Hunter, and then those things would apply to Joe Biden. And it was used on Michael Bloomberg very effectively, that he was also very wealthy. So because of his wealth and his kind of similarities to Donald Trump, that they very much labeled Mike Bloomberg as just another Donald Trump.
Interesting. And that worked.
Well, he didn't do too well. So
did not do too well.
Yeah.
True.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we go through here, we know the topics that are going to come up tonight. They're around COVID, they're family, national security. There are 6 of them that were announced last Friday by the moderators, by the debate committee. So are you expecting these candidates to use sort of the same ones they always use? Do you expect them to unexpected things to come up? So COVID, American families, race in America, climate change, national security, and leadership. I'm looking at those topics and I can almost guess what each of the candidates are going to say on those points, except when we get to national security and leadership, because I'm not sure that either of them have a well-known shtick on those issues. Am I missing something? Or are you seeing it that way as well?
Just related to COVID, going back to the last debate, because I've seen this same defense used by both President Trump and I believe Mike Pence used it as well, is a false equivalency. So that technique was used to compare COVID to H1N1, the swine flu. And you may be familiar with this. This argument is comparing the way Obama handled H1N1, which infected 60 million people, compared to the COVID-19 response. And the difference, it's a false equivalency because H1N1, COVID-19 is 135 times more deadly than H1N1. So while this huge number of people did get infected with H1N1, only 14,000 died. So again, that's a really good defense. If you don't actually know the numbers, you can say, wow, 60 million people got infected by H1N1. You know, there's only how many million people? 8 million people infected by, what's the latest numbers on that? Is it 8 million?
Roughly 8 million, maybe heading toward 9.
It doesn't sound that bad when you make that comparison. But again, that's a technique. That's something that we might see tonight, because every time it keeps being used over and over again, that same argument, comparing COVID to H1N1. Without mentioning one is 135 times more deadly than the other.
Right. So that's almost a false equivalence and cherry picking, right? So cherry picking is a term that I've come to know, but I'm not sure if everybody knows what that is, or really what false equivalence is. Maybe you should explain a little more completely.
Is you're implying two things are essentially the same when they only have anecdotal differences. So they only have some similarities, and it is definitely a form of cherry picking because you're cherry picking just the similarities. One's a virus, the other one's a virus.
Right.
So, you
Say,
know, you're
saying
presenting
if
them
you've
as the
got,
same when, of course, they're not the same. One's far more deadly than the other.
right. So apples and chocolate bars are both sweet, but they are not both healthy.
Right.
Although I consider chocolate an important part of my diet, but that's sort of a different thing. Um, so the other thing you have mentioned is that we were talking about is cherry picking. I think cherry picking is a really interesting idea, as is false equivalence. So talk about cherry picking too. And then I want to get to another thing that I thought was really interesting that you said yesterday when we were talking. So talk about cherry picking. What happens with cherry picking?
Actually, if I can just switch screens for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll give you a textbook example of that.
Great.
Okay, I think we're here. Let's find cherry picking.
I really like how you have these terms indexed to examples. It makes it a lot easier to sort of understand and appreciate what you're getting at.
Of treason, and there might have been pundits and analysts.
Yeah, pundits and Democrats did that, absolutely. But the fact is, we've seen 2,800 subpoenas, 500 witnesses, 500 warrants, 40 FBI agents, 19 attorneys, and a partridge in a pear tree, all to find.
Accuse the president of.
All right, so that was a critique of the Mueller report. So what Hogan Gidley did there was he simply cherry picked all of the cost related to the investigation, you know, literally right down the line, and didn't mention any of the actual findings. So if you only mention that side, it sounds like a complete waste of time.
Right. And in
And then
fact, there was some revenue generated from that too, wasn't there?
That's true. That's true.
No executive privileges, and it said 19 lawyers, 40 agents, 500 witnesses, 2,800 subpoenas over 2 years, millions and millions of dollars, and those were the conclusions. Braden said they exert.
Okay, so again, it's exactly the same argument again.
Almost like they had discussed it in advance.
So recognizing only information that supports your point of view while ignoring any that doesn't.
Got it. So one of the things I thought was really interesting as we were talking about this, and we were talking about whether we were going to, how we were going to watch the debate itself tonight. One of the things you said was, no, you can't necessarily assign the techniques in real time. Sometimes something goes by, you know something was squirrely about it, but you can't really name it until you go back and rewatch the film. Can you talk about that a little bit and how we get tricked? Like why is it so hard to discern these tricks in real time?
When you know the techniques very well, it becomes easier to spot them and know exactly what you're seeing. If you know them somewhat, you typically, let's say you don't know them at all. Typically when you watch a debate, if something doesn't feel quite right, you're not quite sure, you didn't really hear an answer, but you're not quite sure what happened. If you have that feeling, it's very, very high likelihood that a technique was used. And then if you were to go back and watch that particular clip again, you could actually see, and if you looked at the list, exactly which technique was used for that.
Interesting.
So you may not know what technique was used, but you know something was there.
So it raises a little flag. So are there other, there were, one of the conversations we had earlier also was about interrupting and the fact that this debate's going to be kind of different because for the first 2 minutes of each answer, the candidates will not be able to interrupt one another. You had said that this was something that Trump was particularly good at. And I thought, that's weird. How can someone be better at interrupting someone than someone else? So what did you actually mean by that?
In past Donald Trump debates, he's been very effective with interrupting. He's good at certain things, and he's very good at them. President Trump's very fast in a debate, very quick thinker. He's very good at throwing an opponent off base. He's also very, very good at getting in the last word, which is a very important technique, because that's the last thing people remember, is the last thing you heard. You remember that more than anything that came before that. He's extremely effective at that. So not being able to interrupt is actually it's actually a disadvantage for him, because he's so good at it. Now, in the last debate, he probably did too much of that, and it kind of, had the reverse effect. But if you watch a Clinton-Trump debate, he interrupted almost as much, but he just didn't go over the line as he did in the last debate. So it worked for him then.
Did he not go over the line, or are we just not used to it?
Well, in his debates with Clinton, he interrupted, but it wasn't to the extent that it was in the first debate with Vice President Biden. And I think they counted the number of interruptions, and it was, I don't know, something like 84.
It was a big number. I remember seeing that too, but I can't remember exactly what it was. I seem to recall that was part of what made him effective in the primaries, in the Republican primary debates too. And there was, 100 Republican candidates on the stage, all of them trying to get a word in. It was a little bit like that at the Democratic primary debates too. There were so many people on the stage. There were so many candidates that it actually seemed to me that those primary debates were harder than a one-on-one debate, because the rhythm of it is so often so weird, and you don't know when you're supposed to step in, etc. So was that part of why Trump was ended up doing so very well in those early Republican primaries?
Donald Trump is a very good debater, and he does the techniques he does very well and very effectively. And it's not surprising that he did as well as he did. If you ever watch Donald Trump in a debate, he's very effective. He's a very dangerous person to debate, unless you're completely prepared for his techniques and what he does well.
So if you had to debate someone like that, and this may be a question that you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, but how would you prepare to deal with an opponent who used those sorts of techniques?
Well, I think the first thing you do is you look at prior debates and see how they respond to different arguments. And we just mentioned a couple of questions that he's been asked and how he's responded to them. And then you're simply prepared for those responses. And you can undermine him if you know what the response is. So if somebody comes out and starts comparing COVID to H1N1, you can mention, well, COVID is 135 times more deadly than H1N1. And the thing is, you always have to get in the last word. So you wait for them to finish, and then you follow it up with that, at that opportunity.
Got it. And so Biden, who tends to go with he has a more anecdotal style. He likes to tell a story. What are some of his other go-tos?
I'll give you one that he's used since he started the campaign, and this is literally since his intro video, his campaign video, and you're very familiar with this. He mentioned that Donald Trump said there were very fine people on both sides, and he did it in the last debate as well. Well, what he's actually doing is taking that statement out of context, because that's taking it out of context. What Donald Trump actually said was, and you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. So again, it's just simply taking that part of that statement out of context to make it sound more damaging. Not that it wasn't damaging to begin with, but you're actually just compressing it a little bit to make it sound a little bit worse than it was to begin with. And that's something he literally has used all throughout the whole campaign. He keeps mentioning that same statement over and over again. But that's not the actual statement. That's the out of context statement.
Got it. So if you are preparing to debate Joe Biden, what are you worried about?
Well, I mean, Biden, from the analysis, Biden doesn't use a whole lot of techniques as far as sheer number. He's going to do common folk. He's going to mention that out of context, probably that out of context statement tonight. Biden does a lot of, well, I mean, relatively a lot of slogans in a debate. Also, in the last debate, he did the phrase, "He doesn't have a plan" 5 times. Now, I don't know how President Trump can combat that, effectively, but that is something that Biden will probably do tonight as well.
So that's a slogan technique that's just sort of.
Yeah, he's doing it ad nauseum. So he's just saying that he doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have a plan. And in the last debate, he said it 5 times. Probably one of Biden's most vulnerable points, and you could see it even in the Harris debate, was the packing the court question. Biden has not answered that question. Harris answered it with the whataboutism. So that's something obviously you'd want to press them on because they're not answering that question.
Yeah, I actually think he gave a bit of an answer today about some bipartisan commission, yada, yada.
I haven't seen that.
So, yeah, maybe that came out today as a way to prepare to deflect tonight, right?
That might be his answer tonight.
That, yes, yeah. I'm guessing it will be. So for me, I find sort of understanding this list of techniques and a little bit about what they look for and to see some of these patterns, I think it's going to be more interesting to watch, because instead of just kind of following, we're looking for patterns. We're looking to see if they, which of them is more adept at deflecting the difficult things. Usually the one that deflects, uses these techniques most effectively, or at least deflects the techniques that the other person is using more effectively, ends up seeming as though they've won the debate. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's if they're properly prepared and know what to expect. Typically, anybody going into debate of this nature should be very prepared for every question they're going to get, and they should already know what the answer is before they're even asked the question. But a lot of these answers will be techniques. And if the question is hard, you're probably going to get a technique in the answer. You're not going to get an answer, you'll get a technique.
So just for fun, ahead of this conversation, you sent our team this, your list of top 10 most common techniques, particularly that these 2 candidates tend to use. So just for fun, we made this bingo card. So in a few minutes when the debate starts, we are going to invite you. You can download this, people who are watching, people who are on our pages, you can download this card and fill it in as you identify, as these things come up during the debate. We've got a couple extra here. So if Biden mentions Scranton, you get to mark the square, or my husband says you get to drink. Your choice, you can do both, that's fine. You can mark the square and have a shot of whiskey, it's fine. And then we're gonna post, as we go along, we're gonna post the ones we check off into our Facebook page and our Twitter feed. And if anybody wants to sort of come join us and play along, we think that'll be kind of fun, make it a little bit more interesting, see if we actually get more insight into the candidates this way, also just make it more fun to watch. Any other thoughts on what we should be thinking about tonight and how we can make sense of what we're going to see?
As far as truth-based techniques, I'll just cover those very quickly because these were claims from the last debate you might see again because they've
Okay.
been repeated many times. President Trump has often said that 2 million people would now be dead if Biden was president. That would be considered a baseless claim. We're not quite sure where he's getting that 2 million number from. Joe Biden has said that President Trump was the first president in American history to have fewer jobs when leaving office. That's actually a false claim. That's not true. Hoover had fewer jobs when he left office. Donald Trump, another baseless claim is that governors, Democratic governors, are keeping the economy shut down until after the election. Again, that's a baseless claim. It's also a kind of conspiratorial idea. Cherry picking, Biden has mentioned this in the last debate. Violent crime increased under the Trump administration. And that's actually what Biden is doing there is he's cherry picking. He's looking at his entire term of 8 years with Barack Obama, and he's focusing just on 7 months between 2019 and 2020 of Trump's time in office for those figures. Final false claim, and Donald Trump has made this many times, this won't sound new. He's built the greatest economy in the history of the country. There's a lot of data that clearly shows that's not the case. And another one from Joe Biden, he's said this is another cherry picking claim that we have a higher deficit with China now than we did before. And that's actually not true. It's 12% lower than it was in 2016. So those are different things that would typically show up in like a PolitiFact or a factcheck.org fact check on the debate.
Yeah. So in our channels, we really like both PolitiFact and factcheck.org. We'll share our own rumor reality cards. You'll see us share stuff from PolitiFact and factcheck.org. I believe they're very credible. They do careful research. And we'll be following along. So I think there's about 10 minutes before the debate starts. So if you would like to, we'll post this link into our different channels so you can download this. If you have any comments or you're finding bingo squares, anyone who's watching, and you want to share them with us, please do. We think that'll make it more fun. We'll certainly share ours, as well as fact checks as they're relevant. Mike, I really want to thank you for taking us through some of these ideas. Just the value of being able to, propaganda works because it's manipulative, right? And people who are really good at it understand how to distract people's attention from, or get them thinking, get their thinking off track into a different place. And none of us want to be fooled by that, and all of us are sometimes. So I think really understanding these ideas and digging deep into them and learning more about them, seeing the examples on your site, help us defend against getting tricked by candidates, by disinformation, etc. So I really admire your work. I find the way you've organized it to be really easy to get into and frankly kind of addictive. Once you start working on your site, you kind of, I was like, oh really? And what's the video for that? And what example did you use there? It's interesting. So I really appreciate you being here tonight and taking us through some of these ideas. We're going to have a little, we have our own Slack channel going where we'll be sharing some ideas, but we'll definitely be sharing on our Facebook pages and on Twitter as well. And for those of you who are watching, hope to hear from you as well. And we'll talk to you. Apparently it's my kid's bedtime now. So we'll see you in the digital space in just a few minutes. Everybody get your popcorn or your whiskey or whatever gets you through a debate, and we'll see you shortly.
Thank you.
Oh, and if you want the card, we'll put it there, and we'll also put the link to propwatch.org so that you can start messing around with these cool examples and become a much more sophisticated thinker about how to avoid getting fooled, how to avoid getting tricked, how to avoid getting manipulated. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. It was great being here.